God bless everyone. Glad to see you. Glad you're here. It's a lot of fun for me to share the word, especially with these particular subjects. They're interesting, they're exciting. They equip us to help other people who really want to know and understand God and really want to know that they're basing their beliefs on something that's real, it is truthful, it fits. As a matter of fact, it fits much better than worldly wisdom and worldly philosophies. It's straight out of the mouth of God. So it's a wonderful time to be here and to share these things. I think this is around 15 in our series of foundational teachings on the foundations of Genesis. I want to thank our brother Jim Burzo here, and I want to make sure this gets recorded because he put a lot of effort into something I want to show you. I'm going to share my screen here so you can see what the work he's done. And some of you have probably already seen it to some degree, but he put together this YouTube channel called In You Christ. And it's, as you can see here, if you're putting it in the address line, it's in union with Christ with an underscore followed by the number 7 to kind of make us unique. So there's bunches of channels called Union with Christ, etc. So he moved away from the other one because we were just kind of hard to find there. This one we're hoping. And so your old link doesn't work anymore. So this is the new link, and I'm going to send this out tomorrow and with our to people that are regularly come to here to listen. And once you get there, you have a home button here. If you can see my cursor, you got a home button, and that just if you click home, it just shows the most recent one, and then it shows a bunch of other things below. Now, if you want to get more focused on playlists, Jim has divided this up into playlists. Which here's in all videos. It has all 27 videos. You can see 27. And then I did a series on the last days of Jesus Christ. There's probably going to be a couple more added to that when Jim gets an opportunity to upload them. And then the tour of Israel, which I probably did 50 some. And bless Jim, sorry, it takes a while to get those uploaded. He's got 11 so far. And he's very up to date with the Genesis series, which, as you can see, I think there's 14 so far. So tonight will be 15. So if you want to, people that you think might be blessed by this because they have questions about evolution, creation, flood, Tower of Babel, all this stuff, you might guide them here. So that's available, and I'll send this link out to you tomorrow so you can drop your other one, and we can go for there. So tonight we're going to go into chapter 10 of Genesis. And last week, you can turn if you want to. We're going to start in 10. There'll be a moment before we get there. But last week, we studied chapter 9 of Genesis and saw that God commanded his sons after they came off the ark to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. That was the command he gave to Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives. And it's very similar to the one they gave to Adam and Eve. And it's kind of like a do-over here. We started with 2 humans back in Genesis 1:1. Now we're up to 8 humans. We went up way up. And then there was the Nephilim had corrupted and they made a hybrid, non-redeemable race of Nephilim. And the thoughts and the intents of the hearts of man were only evil all the time. And we think we have it bad now. It was much worse back then. And so he had to take care of it in order for Jesus Christ to come. He's about ready to corrupt the believer's line. And then that would have meant all mankind who had ever lived and ever would live would die. So it was a critical thing that God had to do. He had to get involved and he had to take charge and make this thing work. And so he did with the flood. And he starts over with Noah and his family. And we read that some strange things occurred after they got off the ark. Some cool things started. They did their sacrifices, and then Noah got right to work on the ground and built a vineyard, got drunk, and then we had some weird stuff happen in his family with Ham, and then during that teachings last week, we read about the cursing of the line of Canaan, not Canaan himself, or not Ham himself, and the lines of Shem and the lines of Japheth, and the blessing of those two lines, Shem and Japheth, and the cursing of the line of Ham through Canaan. And tonight we're going to go into chapters 10, and we'll see how far we get into 11. And we're going to take time to go through the descendants. You may have never really read these things closely, but we're going to take a moment to go, or more than a moment, to get through all these descendants and talk about them a little bit. And here God's going to be showing a history of the descendants from Noah and his three sons that were born after the flood. Now it focuses on the sons, and you're going to see what their descendants. And there's something I'm going to tell you before we get too into this, is sometimes the Bible is not always chronological. And those of you who've gone through the Old Testament or you read the book of Revelation, it's not always chronological. Be nice if it were, but it's not. And so sometimes things happen that you think should have happened after actually happened before. And so God sometimes will lay out some summaries of stuff, and then he gets into the specifics. You're very aware of this because remember, just in Genesis 1, Adam and Eve, and then he goes on through the animals and goes on through the 6 days of creation, and then he rested on the seventh, and then he gears up and goes over on Genesis 2, and then he goes through the details of Adam and Eve, how he took part from the man to make Adam and Eve, to make Eve. So sometimes he does it, and that's what he did here. Genesis 10 did not come before Genesis 11. Now, what we're going to see is Genesis does not precede the events of 11. It just summarizes and introduces those events. Genesis 10 sums up what happened, and Genesis 11 tells us how it happened. And so we need to keep that in mind too, and that when we read Genesis 10, not all these people were born before the Tower of Babel. This is a descendants line. Probably the Tower of Babel started around the fourth generation as we get into this. So we're going to have Noah, his sons, and we're going to be like into fourth generations. And then the other ones are going to be born after. So it's not like all these people showed up and then they went off and built the Tower of Babel. So keep that in mind. And I'll point that out why we know that as we go through this particular deal. All righty. And there's another reason that God did this, because reversing this, because at the end of 11, he wants to go into the descendants of Shem, and he's going to go because Shem is a believer's line. So he's not going to jump back and forth. He gets all the genealogy out of the way. Then he tells you the story of Babylon, and then he takes off and he goes into the whole Old Testament records, starting with Shem all the way through Abraham and on, and Judges, and on and on and on and on through Malachi. So we got a whole book of records here, and that's another reason why he did that. Now I'm going to show you a quick picture here, and let me I'm going to put this up first so you can see it. And tonight we're going to have quite a few photos, I think. And let me share the screen now. And this is going to, as you turn into chapter 10, this everything on a chart, pretty much, what we're going to read in chapter 10. And this is called, you might have heard this called the nations, the table of nations. And I understand that to some degree. And if you'll look in other places, you'll find out there are these 70 nations. Now, if you count up the children, my understanding is on this, that the children of Noah they each had a certain number of sons. Japheth has 14, Ham had 30, and Shem had 26. That adds up to 70, which refers to the nations, because this family spread out around the world eventually. And they got hung up here, which we're going to see in a little bit. But here you have at the top, you've got Noah, and you have Japheth, Shem, and Ham. Japheth was the firstborn. even though oftentimes Shem's name is put first, just because God honors him because he's part of the believer's line. So you have Japheth, Shem, and Ham. So we got Japheth over here and his sons, and then we got Shem. And if you go down the line, you'll find Shem down here, and it gives some of his sons, and then it says other sons and daughters. And then it gives Aram's, and then you'll see all these Salah now and these others, but Shem is the big deal because Salah, Eber, Peleg, and then there's going to be others, and eventually it leads to Christ. So in this line is Abraham. Eber is kind of a unique one because Eber is the word from which Hebrew will come from. And so Eber comes up from time to time, and we'll see that as we go through. And then we got Ham over here, and then he has his family, Canaan, who had his, and the line got cut off, but this is his line and his line. And then you have all these. He had a big family. He had probably the largest. And so that just gives you an idea of all of this genealogy we're going to go through here. And so let's go into Genesis chapter 10 here. And it's actually called in the REV, which I am using the REV, and I've used quite a bit of the REV commentary to help with put together this teaching, as well as answers in Genesis. And the book, which I'll show you here in a little bit, it's called the Tower. Well, maybe I'll show it to you now. It's called the Tower of Babel, and I'll give you a better shot of that label later. And so you can get this book if you're interested in getting into a lot of detail. So the Tale of the Nations. Now, these are the descendants of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Japheth was the oldest, Shem the middle, and Ham was the youngest. And the sons were born to them after the flood. So now we got the sons of Japheth. You got Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tyrus. Now the next line takes his first son, Gomer, and now we're going to talk about the sons of Gomer, which are Ashkenaz, Ripphah, and Togarmah. Then we're going to skip a couple in here, and we're going to go to Javan, and then you have the sons of Javan are Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. And then from these, the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, each according to his own tongue, according to their clans within their nations. And they're saying, what? Own tongue? Everybody spoke the same thing. That's right. In the beginning, this is just a summary. And Genesis 11 actually occurred. That's when they had their own tongue, their different languages. Then we have the sons of Ham, which are Cush, Mizraim, Put. How would you like to name it? Put. And Canaan. And Canaan we know because of the Canaanites. Matter of fact, Israel took over the land of Canaan, and a big part of that, and that became Israel. But so you got Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan, and then Cush is picked out, and that gives his sons. And then we have, it goes on, and sometimes it just doesn't go through each one. God chooses not to tell us everybody. Now, he does point out that Cush, and we go down here to Cush. Now he's going to talk to first man, all these, and then he brings out Nimrod, because Nimrod's a big deal. And Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first to be a mighty one on the earth. Well, as soon as we hear mighty ones, what do you all think about? You know, if you're like me, you think about Nephilim. But he's going to have the characteristics of a Nephilim, but he's got a dad, and his dad is Cush. So he can't be Nephilim if he's got a human dad, right? We know how the Nephilim showed up. But he is not a good guy. He's a bad guy. And we're going to see some of the stuff that he does here. So he's the first of the mighty one on earth. Now, that would be the first after the flood. There were lots of mighty people on the earth before the flood. A lot of them were Nephilim, huge giants and all that. No indication that he is, but he acts like one. He was a mighty hunter before God. Well, most people read that and say, oh, that's nice. He's probably good with a bow and arrow. But there's more to it than that. So Nimrod, it's kind of an odd name. And it's kind of a different name because it's a descriptive name. And it means, I'll get into it in a moment here. I don't see my note. It has something to do with being rebellious. It gives the sense of defiance, possibly by when he says that he was a mighty one before God, a mighty hunter before Yahweh. The sense is a defiance, possibly by even placing himself before or in front of Yahweh. He was not a good guy. And he probably, the word named Nimrod, here it is, let us rebel. And that's probably not his given name. These other people like Sheba and Havilah, and those are their given names, but Nimrod seems to be a descriptive name. You probably know that Job was probably not his given name, because what mother would ever name her son persecuted one? you know, it is a descriptive name that he got that name after all this stuff happened to him and he was called the persecuted one. That makes sense. But he most likely was not born with that name. We're thinking the same thing with Nimrod. He probably had another name, and but it's not given here. We're giving a descriptive name. It's kind of like the devil. He is the adversary. He is the devil and Satan. He's the slanderer. He's given descriptive name. Matter of fact, we do not know what his real name is. We'll probably have to wait to find out. My guess is that when his original name, when he was first created, he was a magnificent spiritual being that was in charge of worship and music and other things it said. And he was the top dog as far as highest in power within the angelic realm. But once he fell, that name was never revealed to us, and he was called descriptive. And that's what we think about Nimrod, a mighty hunter before God, and that before, since it's kind of like against God. And this is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before Yahweh. And so that's what we're thinking. This guy's bad because we're going to see his characteristics are bad as we go in. It doesn't talk too much. It doesn't say he ever killed a cow or an animal. It never talks about his hunting skills under here. So we don't think it's really hunting. The beginning of his kingdom was in Babel. Okay, that tells you something right there. Babel, and then he's also involved with these other places, Erich, Akkad, Akkad, Calneh, in the land of Shinar. Now, the land of Shinar is what is present day Iraq. And out of that land, he went into Assyria. So, he goes into Shinar, and let me check one here. And so, okay, good. He begins to build this kingdom, and Shinar is present day Iraq. Now, Akkad here that I just read is also called, spelled A-K-A-D, Akkad, or Akkad. Currently, the location is not known, but we do know it was a very important city. And one of the language that came out of Babel was called Akkadian, and it was named after the city. Now, it's now a dead language, but it was part of Nimrod's early kingdom, and it was one of the languages that God made for humans. It was spoken there and in huge areas over there. Tablets with this language have been found on it in Iraq, to Turkey, Iran, and Egypt. And even though it's a dead language, it was spoken by many back then. Okay, let's go on to Genesis. We're in 11. So now also out of this land, so we have this, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. So he's going to be a king, and he's going to be kind of like a chieftain instead of being a part of the patriarchal type of deal where the heads of the families, the elders ran it. He's rising up and taking over and beginning his own kingdom. out of the land that he also went into Assyria, and then he also built Nineveh. Well, that's a familiar place, right? Now, Nineveh, remember the book of Jonah? And Jonah didn't want to go there because he thought they would repent. And sure enough, they did. Eventually, they came and they conquered Israel. So, Nineveh, let's take a look. I think I've got a picture here. Yeah, I want to show you here. And I'm going to bring up a picture real quick here. I'm going to stop sharing here and then I'm going to bring that up to make sure I'm in the right spot. Okay, there it is. All right. I'll share again. Here, I'm going to zoom in here. And so Babel, and we're going to get into the Tower of Babel here in a little bit. So first of all, get a whole picture here, what we're looking at. Here's the Mediterranean Sea right here, the Black Sea up here. And, this is where Turkey is now. This is, excuse me, Greece. And here's Israel, where Israel will be, Judah. And here we have, which is present day Iraq. And this shows the Assyrian Empire. And as I just said, they eventually went in there. But Babylon is where Babel is located, in this Babylon area. And I'm going to show you some pictures a little later on that I think will be really interesting to you. But there's Babylon. So he's in this area that it talks about, that we just read about. But then he moves out of this area. And look up here, we've got Nineveh. So there's Nineveh. See Nineveh? So here's Nineveh. Okay. Now we're going to be, so you get a perspective. Now it's kind of interesting that the ark landed up in here. I'm going to show you a map where it's clear, but the mountains of Ararat were here, over here in far eastern Turkey. So you can see they didn't have to travel too far. But this is where things really started happening after the flood. Okay, so I'll stop sharing that. So we'll go back into Genesis. I can reshare again, and we'll go back into Genesis. And here we go. And then he also built Reason, which was between Nineveh and Calah, which is a great city. And now we're going to go back to the descendants here. So we've got Mizraim fathered these guys, Ludin, and Anaman, Lahaban, and Nathtuhim, Pathrusium, and Calusim, from whom the Philistines came out. So this is, as Moses is writing this, God is revealing to him that he wants things documented, that the Philistines, and it probably came out of both of these areas, but this is where the Philistines came from. And they were certainly a thorn in the flesh to Israel. Canaan fathered Sidon, his firstborn, and then Heth, the Jebusite. Now, Jebusite, what does that make you think of? You might be thinking of Jerusalem. That was originally a Jebusite city. The Amorite, the Girgashite, the Hivite, the Archite, the Sinite, the Arvadite, the Semorite, and the Hamathite. Afterwards, the clans of the Canaanites were spread out. So we're talking about this pretty big deal of Canaanites. The territory of the Canaanites was from Sidon, and it included going to the direction of Gerar. And I'm going to show you a map here. Sidon is way up north and in the direction of Gerar to Gaza. Everybody knows where Gaza is these days. Then going to the direction of Sodom. Okay, we know how wonderful a place that was, Sodom and Gomorrah. And then Admah and Zeboim to Lashah. And these are the sons of Ham, according to their clans, according to their tongues, which is going to come about soon, in their lands, according to their nations. They divided up, and people who spoke the same language normally stuck together. So I want to stop sharing here, and I want to show you. I'm going to go back to my photos here, and I'm going to go over to this other one right next door. And this is Canaan. Now this probably looks a lot like Israel to you, because it looks like Israel, Canaan. So up here, we just read about Sidon, and then we read about, let me zoom in here so you can see better. So Sidon is way up north. And then over here, you have the Sea of Galilee. Here's Bethlehem, just so you get the idea of where things are. And as we move down, then we get specifically told Gaza. See, there's Gaza. Gaza's on the coast. This is the Mediterranean Sea. And then, if you remember, I believe Sodom and Gomorrah, I don't think they've ever found Gomorrah. Maybe there's some parts of it, but that was in this area. So it seems like Canaan went from the Mediterranean all the way over to Jericho. I mean, to the Jordan River. So that's pretty much where Israel is today. Okay, so go back to Genesis. And then to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber. Now, Eber is down the line a little bit, but we're already talking about Eber. So to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth, the elder. So Japheth is told here that he is the elder. To him were also sons born. The sons of Shem were Elam, Ashur, Arpachshad. He is in the believer's line. Lud and Aram. And then the sons of Aaron, Uz, the land of Uz. No, that's not the land of Oz. The land of Uz. We got Hul, Gether, and Mash. And then we're bringing this guy up again, Arpachshad, who fathered Shelah. Again, this is the bloodline of going down to Abram. And Shelah fathered Eber. And Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg. For in his days, the earth was divided. So we're going to talk about that for a moment. For in his days, the earth was divided. Now, some think they've translated this in several ways. Also, it's brought up in 1 Chronicles 1:19, something very similar. It talks about the two sons of Eber. But Peleg, for in these days, the earth was divided. So what does that mean? So one way, some have said that this is true. There is geological evidence that at one time the continents were together, right? We talked about that before, one major continent. And then through plate tectonics and continental shift, the continent moves apart like they are today. And there's evidence that they're still moving, of course, a lot slower. We still have earthquakes. After the flood, the earth could have been separated very quickly into basically what we have now. Now, the problem is, I find that very difficult for that to occur during the lifetime of Peleg. He is like fourth generation away from Noah. And all of a sudden the continents start moving rapidly and form all these. I don't think that's the case. With such major, I think and I think it holds up based on what scripture says, that this original continent, which it seems to be the case, all that moving around happened under the floodwaters and during the flood, when the mountains lifted and the valleys fell, and we had all this volcanism, all these volcanoes going off, this huge uproar on the earth. That's where it seemed. In the ocean, the fountains of the deep opened up, all their water came out. There's tremendous activity in the crust of the earth. I believe that's when it occurred, as during the time of Noah. It seems pretty difficult to imagine that occurring 4 generations away from Noah, and then all of a sudden this happens and then stops. Why and how? What I think is more reasonable is that it's if the word could be referring to the people of the earth, instead of the earth was divided, it's the people of the earth. And it was during Peleg's time that probably the Tower of Babel was occurred and the people were divided into different language groups on earth. I think that sounds much more reasonable. But others believe that both happened at the same time. The languages were divided up and the continent split up there during the life of Peleg. So no, we can't prove anything, but I lean toward, as I have all along, that this occurred during the continental shift occurred during the flood. And there's lots of scientists and lots of people who are very smart say this is what occurred. So let's go back to Genesis 10, and I'm going to share my screen again, and we'll go to Genesis 10. Let's see, I think we're in. Yes, we're in. Okay, then we're continuing. Jatan fathered Aladad, Shephath, this is a long one, Hazarmaveth, Jerha, Hadaram, Uzal, Dikla, Obal, Abimael, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah, and Joab. All these are the sons of Joktan. Their dwellings were from Mesha as you go towards Zephar, the mountain to the east. So we're starting to tell us, they're giving clues where these people moved. And as you know, that we talked about Canaan and who moved there. Now we're talking about Mesha and where they're moving. And these are the sons of Shem, according to their clans, according to their tongues, in their lands, according to their nations. And the clans of Noah, let me see here. In the clans of Noah, the sons of Noah, according to their generation and in their nations, from these the nations were separated on the earth after the flood. So the nations were separated on earth after the flood. This is a result of what happened with the Tower of Babel. So this is a summary statement of what happened that it anticipates people spreading out all over the earth. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Japheth had 14 sons that are named, and it says other sons and daughters, and Ham 30, and Shem 26, which is supposed to be equal to 70, which is called the 70 nations. So now I'm going to show you a movie. I think you're going to enjoy it, but I'm going to show you a couple of pictures first because some of the pictures aren't really clear in the movie. So let me stop sharing. Let me go over to the photos. Okay, so that's Canaan, and this is Nineveh. Now we're going to see that one, but you can see this. I think this is really interesting here. Let me go back here. This is a zoom in on ancient Babylon. And I showed you on that big map just earlier. This is the Euphrates River that flows near, you've heard of the Tigris and Euphrates. Well, this one flows near Babylon. And if you zoom in on here, they have remnants of the ancient gardens of Babylon, which you'll probably remember the guy who set those up. It's thought to be the king of Babylon. And they still have museums there. But here's what they're saying is the location of the Tower of Babel. Now, this is a satellite view. So in this south side of the city, we've got this, that you can see, it's a square. And let me take, I'm going to give you a close up here. I think I'm going to, yeah. So this is a close up of what they believe is the base of the Tower of Babel. Now, I understand this is like 300 feet square. And so we're going to, some of these pictures are going to be in the movie, but I thought I'd give you an idea here. So here we got the Tower of Babel here. And then if you remember, we've got Nineveh that's up in here, pretty around there. And then this is Turkey. This is where the mountains of Ararat are, down in this area. So you can see the proximity. They got off the boat. Now they are, and then they headed down in different directions here, not too far away. And Yes. So this is another close up. Here's the Tower of Babel. You had the Euphrates River, and then you had the Babylon Tourist Resort. And then you've got ancient Babylon and the ancient city of Babylon, the remains of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, all in this area. So you have this is where we believe the tower, or they believe the Tower of Babel was. And so I'm going to show you this movie here, and I think it'll be interesting. Now I don't start it at the very beginning because there's some information I don't think is necessary for our purposes, and I'm going to stop it after a minute or so, and I'm going to fast forward it because he talks about his ancestor being the Queen of England, which is really nice, but it doesn't fit with what we're trying to share. So this is going to be a YouTube, so I'm going to switch over to YouTube, and I'm going to make this bigger, and I think I've done everything, so you should hear the sound. If you can't hear it, just open up your mic and say, hey, I can't hear it. So here we go. Now, let me warn you, this man moves quickly. And the way this was edited, it was edited to take out any of the pauses, the natural pauses when you're teaching. And so you'll see that there was editings because he'll jump around. He's in one spot and then he moves to another. So you have to really follow closely, but I'm going to give you a link to this. So if you miss something and want to hear it, you'll be able to listen to it afterwards. And if you can't, I think I've shown you the charts that are not very readable already. So I think you'll be in good shape. So let's give a listen.
Tower of Babel, the Bible gives us a lot more information than you might think. In Genesis chapter 10, it gives you a breakdown, those genealogies. That is a set of these different genealogies, the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And then we see their descendants and how it was split apart as a result of what happened in Genesis 11, 1 through 9. Now, I like to look at it graphically, and that's what I've got shown up here at the very top in red. If you can see, as long as you're not colorblind, you can see that Noah is in red there at the top. Then the next line, you have Japheth, Shem, and Ham. And then you can see further breakdowns. Now, sometimes we look at those names, we just skip right over those names. Years of studying the Tower of Babel, I look at these names and I get excited about it because I look at them and I'm like, okay, certain people groups came out of these different people, or that one right there is my ancestor, and so forth. It really is exciting. And you might think, really, you know what your ancestor is? Actually, a lot of people can figure it out generically. Japheth is seen as the father of most of the European nations, some of the North Asian nations, a little bit of the Middle Eastern nations. Shem is a lot of the Middle Eastern and the Far Eastern nations, like India, for example, is also descendants of Shem. Ham has a lot of people as far as China, as well as Africa, some down the Malay Peninsula, extending down into Melanesia, some of those kinds of places. But I actually wrote an article on our website called How Many Human Generations Are There from Adam Until Today? And what I'm doing, I'm specifically looking at my own lineage. One of my lineages on my mother's side actually goes all the way back and ties in to the same lineage as the Queen of England. What's interesting about the Queen of England is she has a lineage that goes all the way back to Noah and all the way back to Adam. So as soon as I got tied into that, I could actually count it up. And in that particular lineage, Adam would be my 84th great-grandfather. Noah would be my 74th great-grandfather. That actually puts me in the 87th generation, to get to great-grandfather level there. I actually tallied this up. I'm using the common usage method, not the consanguinity method, which is actually a lot easier when you're looking at stuff really broad and long-ranged. But Queen Elizabeth would be my 42nd cousin by this lineage. Look at this. Jesus would be my 139th cousin. What a way to witness to people, right? Now, let me tell you about my cousin. So it really is neat. Christ stepped into history to become our relative. We need to remember that. But let's jump back to scripture here. Genesis 11, verse 4. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." So this was the people trying to defy God. And of course, God wasn't going to let them get away with this. So he came down, he confused their language. I've had people say, well, where is this? Where is Babel? Where did all this take place? It would be in modern day Iraq is where this occurred. In the Bible, it's Erech. Erech is one of the names listed there in Genesis chapter 10, one of the early cities. That's where the name Iraq actually comes from. It would have been right in this area, and that's where people were then scattered to go around to different parts of the world. Now I want you to notice this arrow from Babel going down to Africa. See, in the secular worldview, what they do, they have that arrow actually going from Africa right up to about where everything splits apart part up there, if you just reverse their arrow, they'd have it about right. But I've had people say, well, when did all this occur? Well, big picture, it's obviously after the flood because it's Noah's descendants, but it was before the call of Abraham. Okay, so Abraham was not at the Tower of Babel. You know, his people actually came well after the Tower of Babel. Now, Abraham is a descendant of Ur of the Chaldees. The Chaldeans were a Hebrew group, the Eber group, the Eberu group. That's where that comes from. Hebrew comes from Eber. Archbishop James Ussher put the timeline at 2242 BC. He added about 106 years after the flood, which would have been 2348 BC, just to give you an idea in his particular lineage. I've seen a number of chronologists put it as early as when Peleg was born, 101, as high as 130 years. Renowned archaeologist Dr. Clifford Wilson died just a few years ago, but he believed that this particular area there in the ancient ruins of Babylon might have actually been the original Tower of Babel foundation. This large pool, he says, at modern Babylon is over the ruins of an early structure that was possibly the original Tower of Babel. Here's a reconstruction of this Etmananke Tower. You can see how you can go up the stairs and you can kind of go around, and as it goes up, you've got the stairs as you go on around it. So it'll look something like this. And if you use Google Earth, you can actually look down on it, and here is that site and the archaeological remains of ancient Babylon, and you can see how it was definitely a square, and you can see where that initial stepway was. Here, let me back up so you can kind of see that. You know, we're looking straight onto that stepway as you go up initially. You can kind of see that down here on the lower side of it. What's interesting too is the Tower of Babel itself. That Hebrew word for tower is the Hebrew word migdal, which means tower, of course, but it also means figuratively a pyramidal bed of flowers. So it has a connotation of being pyramidal in its shape, which is interesting. A lot of people, as they left the Tower of Babel and went to different parts of the world, you know, particularly they'd settle closer and then they'd move out farther and move out farther. A lot of these cultures initially started to build some of these towers, very similar to what we find at the Tower of Babel. Just in Mesopotamia alone, there's over 30 different ziggurats, and some of them have some interesting names, the Tower to Heaven and Earth and that sort of thing, which gives you an idea they were trying to build it up high, definitely much higher than everything else in the area, but not up into the clouds. That's a misconception. They're trying to build something up into the stratosphere here. I'm going to look at some of the people groups. So I'm going to jump into some of these. Where did the Irish and the Scots come from? Now, I put them together for a reason, because some of these guys actually interchanged some of their positions and intermixed and so forth. Magog, it is his descendants that actually went into Ireland. In fact, we have 3 ancient lineages of the Irish going back to Magog. Just to give you an idea, here's one of them that's found in James Anderson's Royal Genealogies book from the early 1730s. You go Noah, Japheth, Magog, Bath, Phoenicia, Pharsa, Newell, and then that's when you go down to the line to Milo, who goes right in there. And if you look at the Scots have one here that go down through Magog as well, down to Bath, Pharsi, Phineas, and then Rephath, and he was known as the Scot, and that might well be where one of the names actually came from, the Scots in that particular instance. So we do see some of these connections. There's quite a bit of history on this if you want to look more of it up. Well, let's look at the Germans, the English, and the Scandinavians. I mean, what are the odds they would all come together, because they all have the same basic descendants if you actually look at it. Specifically, the English come out of the Anglo tribes and the Saxon tribes and some of the Jute tribes, which were some of the Germanic tribes. A lot of the Scandinavians actually came out of the Germans as well, just to give you a taste. Now, the old name for Germany and the old founder of the German people was Ashkenaz. Noah, Japheth, Gomer, and then Ashkenaz. We actually have ancient lineage that goes through Ashkenaz, down through Manus, all the way down to Wolfheim Stickinger of a united Germany. Ashkenaz actually originally settled there just south of the Black Sea, and then he went to the northern part of the Black Sea. The old Black Sea's name used to be the Ashken Sea, named for Ashkenaz. From there, he moved up to Central Europe with 20 of his sons. One of them was Danius, which is where the Danes came from. One of his sons was Sarmatia, which is where the Sarmatians came from, and so forth. And so a lot of the people in Central and Northern Europe actually were descendants of Ashkenaz. If you actually look at the age decline of people from the time of Noah moving forward, the ages really start to decline. for example, Noah lived 350 years after the flood, and all total lived about 950 years. His son Shem lived about 600 years. About 500 of those years were after the flood. And then you see about 3 generations in there in Shem's line where they were living over 400 years. Then after the events at the Tower of Babel, they were living about 230 years or so, and then they really start to decline. And if you look, Abraham lived 175 years. You go down, Moses lived 120 years, but we see that decline as it starts to go down. I've had people say, well, it was after the flood. Maybe it was because of meat eating. As soon as people started to eat meat, maybe that triggered it, because it wasn't till after the flood people were first allowed to eat meat. But you know what? There's been people who've been vegetarians their whole lives. They don't live 900 years old. Some people thought maybe it was increased oxygen or environmental changes, things like that. And, people studied that for quite some time. There's a little bit of benefit, but overall it's actually more detrimental when you start to add increased oxygen. You add free radicals. That causes bigger problems too. That's why we take antioxidants, for example. Some people think maybe there were some anatomical issues, some mutations, things like that. The biggest thing is probably genetic bottlenecks at the flood and at the Tower of Babel. So that's when we start to see the big shifts of the decrease in age. There may be other factors involved. If you just look after Shem, there was 3 generations that on average lived about 445 years. After Babel specifically, you have 3 generations where people living on average about 236 years. And then boom, it really starts to drop off significantly after that. Hey, where did the French, Portuguese, and Celts come from? It's convenient that those are all put together too. It's almost like I knew the answer to this question. Well, let's look at this. The French, the old name for the French were the Gauls or the Gelts, the Celts. So the Celts actually dominated certain parts of Europe. Portugal, Port of Gaul. You can see the connection in there. They're Gaulish people. Even the Welsh were Gaulish people. A lot of the Celts that were in Brittany and, the British Isles and some of those areas, they intermixed with some of the Irish and the Scots up in those areas. Some of them actually went down and ended up in Galatia. They're more kind of in Eastern Europe, and then as far down as down in Turkey, there was an area known as Galatia as well. Where did the Canaanites and the Chinese come from? So you have the Israelites were given the land of Canaan because of their sin. And that included the Hivites and the Girgashites, the Amorites, Hittites, Jebusites. Jebusites is where Jerusalem is. But the Sinites, think of the Sinai Peninsula, wilderness of sin, Mount Sinai. That particular area there, a lot of those Sinites actually moved out and moved away. And where did they go to? They actually went to what we call the land of Sinim. That's what it's mentioned as in the Bible. Where is the land of Sinim? It's actually the land of the Sinites, the land of what we call China today. Manasseh ben Israel will have it that the Chinese are intended. China is indeed called by Ptolemy the country of the Sinites. Where did the Greeks and the Japanese come from? Boy, I threw the Japanese in there almost like it was an afterthought here. The Greeks are pretty well known. We know where the Greeks came from. They came from Javan. Whenever you see Greeks in the Old Testament, the Hebrew behind that is Javan, one of Noah's grandsons here, Javan. So Javan and his descendants, we see reflection of them all over throughout areas around the Mediterranean Sea. Of course, Greece, Macedonia, certain places of Asia Minor, a lot of those were descendants of Javan. I mentioned Tarshish earlier in Spain. That was descendants of Javan that went out there. Some of them went all over the place. Some of them went as far as Japan. That was a trading outlet for them, and people had recognized that. Of course, the Sinites came in and dominated much of these areas as well. So you got to think there's a lot of other people groups in there, but we at least have that particular lineage traced in there as well. Where did the Egyptians come from? This is also a very well known one. The Egyptians are mentioned quite a bit in Scripture. Genesis 12:10, for example. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt. The Hebrew behind that is Mitzrayim. That's how that's pronounced, even though it looks like Mizraim. It's Mitzrayim. And Mitzrayim is one of Noah's grandsons. And so that's actually where the name Menes comes from, some of the early emperors of Egypt, for example. But Mitzrayim came down here and settled in what we call Egypt today. Even the Philistines are descendants of Mitzrayim as well. So are the Lubim, Libabos, some of the people in Libya ended up being descendants of Mitzrayim as well. What about the Africans? So a lot of times people just want to lump all the Africans together, but they're really not. I mean, if we just look at Egypt, for example, they are a distinct people group. If you look at the Moors, for example, and other parts of North Africa, Northwest Africa specifically, the Moors are descendants of Put. Put originally settled in Libya and then moved farther west. A lot of places in West Africa are descendants of Put. Cush that's actually the name for Ethiopia. A lot of Ethiopians will still call themselves Cushites today. So they came down here and settled just below where Mitzrayim was at. They actually warred with Mitzrayim, that is the Egyptians, for a while. But a lot of the lower part of Africa was actually settled by Cush as well. Where do the Russians come from? A lot of the Russian groups came out of two primary groups. You have Magog and Meshech. Magog moves up here between the Black and Caspian Sea. A lot of the Scythian groups came out of them. And of course, that's where the Irish and the Scots came from. They came out of Magog as well. Some of them migrating over to where Spain was and then moving on up. So if you move over to Meshech, Meshech goes up. They were the North Russians, up farther. Their language family would include a lot of the Finnish groups, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, some of those areas. Even some people in Hungary share that similar language family, which is quite a unique language family. But let's just step back now and look at a big picture at Asia, Africa, and then Australia as people start to migrate down there. So you can see in Africa, you got Put, you got Lower Kush, you've got Joktan all across India there. The Medes and the Persians came out of Media and some of those areas, going all the way down into India as well. Togarmah, Magog, Tubal, and Meshech along the top continue to migrate out in those areas. You see the Sinites dominate much of East Asia. Certain people came out of Gomer and Javan there in Japan. Now, if you look though, I want you to follow this line. You see Cush right in the very middle of some of this. Cush of Seba. Cush of Seba goes right down the Malay Peninsula. Cush is where the Ethiopians came from in Africa, but that's also where the Hindu Kush came from. That's actually where the tribe of Seba in the Malay Peninsula, that area came from as well. Now notice they continued on down. And there's actually genetic ties with the Australian Aborigines to the descendants of Seba there in the Malay Peninsula, and they're also connected genetically to some of the people in Kush in Africa. And that kind of surprised people, but it actually makes sense from a historical perspective. What's the point? Ancient history and geography actually confirm biblical history over.
Okay. So he went fast, didn't he? I'm sure if you were like me, you were thinking, who am I descendant of? You know, Japheth?
I got it.
You got it?
I got it. Yeah, I got it. Yeah,
okay,
sure.
Good. Well, I mean, we went all over the place. Japheth seems to be all over the place, European, which I think most of us have some kind of European descent. And then in all over the place where Shem, we didn't talk too much about Shem, but obviously he's going to be in that Near East, because Shem was the believer's line to Jesus Christ. And then of course you had Ham, who was in Africa and other places. So the maps that he showed, I'm sorry, the background was hard to see because it's so pastel. All those little lines, if you look really closely, you could see the continents. So if you guys happen to listen to this, want to redo this afterwards sometime, as I said, I'll send you the link. But I thought did you enjoy that? Was that good? Did you? I mean, I tell you, I was amazed. What amazes me that he's worked at this like 15 years, and he like crammed about an hour's worth of teaching into 20 minutes. And he has gone and followed this to see where they went. And, so it just adds so much validity to the Tower of Babel, the three sons of Noah and their descendants. They can actually be tracked. They're real. They're not a myth. They lived. We are their descendants. So I think that's pretty cool. So Heavenly Father, thank you for your love and the time we've had together, and just the beauty that's in your word, and how it's so exciting it is that it just makes sense. And people who have that good spiritual worldview can actually look at your word and see, well, how did this work? And they find out how it worked. So thank you that our primary thing is not our genealogy, not who we are descendants of, but we are neither Jew nor Greek, bond or free. We are Church of God. That's the main thing. We are born again. We have the Spirit of God in us. We don't track our genealogy. That doesn't make us special. What makes us special is we track our genealogy to you, God, in our Lord Jesus Christ. So thank you for this wonderful group tonight. Thank you for how you bless us all so mightily and wonderfully. Thank you for a good night's sleep, we ask, for healing, for blessing and protection. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen. Okay.